Hi, year 13s. I hope you and your families are keeping well. This video is primarily for those of you that were unable to attend today's session, but it's also for those of you who are in the process of finishing off your A3 tables on the key principles of the US Constitution. So the way we started off was by looking at the connection between the images below, and what we can gather from the images below and the connection between them is the fact that African Americans have been subject to police brutality over a number of decades, and this has led to the resurgence of protests, peaceful protests to sort of campaign for how African Americans are still subject to racial discrimination and prejudice, with the latest killings of George Floyd. We've seen the resurfacing, we've seen Black Lives Matter movement protests resurface. And one of the links that we made to, obviously, police brutality against African Americans was as you can see in the top right image, the Birmingham, Alabama protest in 1963, whereby the police chief, Paul Connor, authorized the use of police dogs and fire hoses, for example, on innocent civilians, those that were peacefully protesting. But what we're looking to sort of understand is why racial discrimination and prejudice against people of color in America is so sort of rampant, particularly against African Americans. The wider sort of issue that we're looking at, the wider question that we're asking is, why is race such a big issue in America? Here we've got a few statistics here about mass incarceration in the USA, which is in regards to why there's inequalities in sort of representation in the prison population according to different ethnicities. The documentary The 13th is on Netflix, and I highly recommend that you all watch it. Now, the 13th documentary obviously relates to the 13th Amendment of the US Constitution, and the 13th Amendment abolished slavery in 1865. That was signed through by Abraham Lincoln, but it states that slavery was abolished except for punishment punishment for a crime. So essentially, slavery is able to exist in America through the modern day prison system. Modern day slavery exists through the prison system in America. As you can see here, it says blacks account for approximately 6.5% of the US population, but actually make up 40.2% of the USA's prison population. Here we can see sort of unbalanced scales, and scales we typically associate with in the UK and the US, sort of the judiciary, courts, and the law. Here, obviously, we're talking about the American criminal justice system, and the fact that is not equally weighted. So there are prejudices and racial discrimination present in the criminal justice system. It's tipped slightly in favor towards sort of the white privilege, the white institutionalized space, and really it's sort of unfair for African Americans and people of color in particular. Now, these statistics also show you how racial discrimination and prejudice, as well as sort of stereotypical characteristics of African Americans and stereotypical attitudes towards them, have been ingrained in people's minds. Now, one of the things I mentioned in today's session is that you can enforce change in society. You can make change in society, but you cannot force people to change the way they think. And this comes quite apparent over here. Those stereotypical attitudes, those racial prejudices are ingrained in the minds of American sort of state authorities and many areas of the government and the judiciary as well. And it's difficult for them to remove those racial sort of prejudices and biases that they have. So it's all about how it's ingrained in their minds and how that has led to the creation of white institutionalized space. Now, of course, we need to find out why this is the case. And one of the reasons why this is the case is because since the USA was founded as a nation, racial formation was embedded at the heart, of the birth of the United States of America. All right. For example, there was a 3/5 compromise. For every 5 enslaved people who lived in a state, 3 of them would be counted for the purposes of population. Now, the House of Representatives, as you know, was elected in proportion to, members were elected in proportion to the population size of each of the different states. So, for example, states in the Deep South where slavery was widespread, they wanted further representatives, of course, for their own states, which would benefit themselves individually as states, and therefore they wished to count slaves as citizens, even though they had no voting rights or any sort of citizen rights under the U.S. Constitution. And this was a huge victory for slaveholders. So basically, for every 5 enslaved people who lived in a state, 3 of them would be counted for the purpose of the population. Okay. Now, this was a huge victory for slaveholders because they were able to achieve more power in Congress, because they were able to have more representatives. But it was for having people who cannot vote, who cannot be citizens. Okay. So what I asked the Year 13s to think about in the morning was the fact that should these slaves actually really be counted in as citizens, despite the fact that they do not have the rights of regular citizens or regular white people in America at the time. Okay, and that's one of the sort of important things that we discussed. Critical race theorists such as Derek Bell and Glenn Bracey, they also sort of emphasize why the founders opted for a federalist structure, and that was partly for racial purposes, so that in the Deep South, slavery could still sort of remain and remain rife in those areas, so that states could decide their own laws. And whilst many people in the North opposed slavery, people in the South, they were definitely for it, because of the fact that the South was more of a sort of agricultural homeland full of plantations, whereas the North was becoming a little bit more industrialized and sort of developed through sort of factories, etc., etc. So industrialization was rampant in the North. 7 slavery-promoting provisions were also written into the U.S. Constitution. Okay, at the birth of the nation, whites were assigned legal rights to citizens. So the founding fathers assigned legal rights to citizens according to their race. So, for example, who had the right to own property? White people. Who did not? American Indians. And who became the object of property? African Americans. Okay, the Constitution doesn't say anything about black or whites. It doesn't say anything about slavery, or it doesn't mention slaves at all. Okay, the document, okay, the Constitution itself, slaves are referred to as other persons, and that sort of dehumanizes them. It underscores their humanity. It shows you that they're second-class citizens. They're not even treated as citizens. Nowhere in the Constitution or in the Declaration of Independence itself are human beings classified according to race, skin color, or ethnicity. In the Declaration of Independence itself, it stated that all men are created equal, in quotation marks. In the morning today, we unpicked, well, what do they mean by all men? They only really meant white people. Anyone else for them wasn't classified as a man. Again, women, there's nothing mentioned about women. So when we looked at the introduction to the US, introduction to US politics lesson, and we sort of looked at the question, to what extent was the US founded on the basis of equality, we came to the conclusion that the US was not founded on the basis of equality. In fact, it was very, very sort of unequal, it was very unfair, and there were sort of vast discrepancies, vast disparities between races and their treatment. A third factor is that there were sort of anti-miscegenation laws which outlawed interracial marriage, okay, to preserve sort of the sort of white race, the Aryan race, those genes. It sounds a lot similar to Nazi Germany and Hitler's sort of ideology in the 1930s. Immigration and citizenship controls were imposed, and countless ethnic cleansing programs ensued. So you've got the genocide of Native Americans as well. Now, the main thing that we can sort of gather from this is that racial formation was embedded at the heart of the US nation when it was founded, okay? And the founding fathers actively promoted slavery, okay, or holding slaves, or slave ownership, okay? And at that time, there was no concept of equality between various different races. And the US Constitution, whilst it does not specifically state that, it becomes really clear when one reads the US Constitution that there are certain parts which are really, really sort of vague and discriminatory against people of color. And again, this links to why racial prejudices and discrimination still exists in America today, and why race is such a big issue in America today. Because these prejudices, these sort of stereotypical attitudes, they're ingrained in people's minds. okay, as a result of the way in which the US was founded and as a result of its history since it was founded to the present day. Okay, that's really, really important. If you just have a look at this tweet, this tells us about all of the people at the time who were present at the signing of the Declaration of Independence who held slaves. There's only approximately 6 of them who did not hold slaves at the time. The second American president, John Adams, he was actually an abolitionist lawyer who represented many slaves and tried to sort of abolish slavery, okay, to advance the movement to abolish slavery. Many, though, a lot of them, were slaveholders. So they were actively sort of seeking their independence, but they were not really willing to provide independence to African Americans who they sort of held in slavery. Okay, I'm not going to go through these features and the amendment process primarily because of the fact that I've produced a video on this, a whiteboard video, so you can have a look at the nature of the US Constitution and the amendment process videos there. What I will say really, really briefly is that have a look at that video for comparisons between the UK and the USA in terms of codification, entrenchment, and also ways in which the Constitution can be amended. Okay, I mean this is quite simple. The advantages and disadvantages of the amendment process. So you can categorize each of the reasons into advantages of the process and disadvantages, and then you can create a T-chart, and then you might be able to expand on them as well. That's really, really simple. You can use your textbook to help you with that. Right, the key principles. So federalism is basically a theory whereby power is divided between the central government, the federal government, those are synonymous terms, and state governments, okay? So each have their sort of own areas of substantive jurisdiction. For example, foreign policy powers are reserved for the federal government for obvious reasons that only a centralized authority can take sort of control of policies towards other nations or involvement or interference in international affairs. States, for example, have jurisdiction in areas such as education to an extent, health, transport, etc., etc. So the framers, now this was a compromise between strong central government and states' rights. So James Madison states that this was a middle ground, okay, and this middle ground was necessary because the Articles of Confederation were too loose, they were weak and ineffective, okay, because if a quarrel or an issue or problem existed between states, it would be very difficult for those states to resolve them with each other because there is no centralized authority there present to get involved in that conflict to resolve it. So that could also then, between the states themselves, end up in conflict or perhaps even civil war. And that might trigger the reappearance of a centralized authority such as the British. Okay, so that was a no-go for the Federalists, okay, who argued against the Articles of Confederation. And so instead, at the Philadelphia Convention, the Connecticut Compromise was made, and that was the solution of a strong central government to be a part of the US Constitution, of course, but certain rights reserved for the states. So those rights, so those powers that are not reserved for the federal government, those are to be reserved for the states. And the 10th Amendment backs that up. Now, federalism involves a degree of decentralization suitable for a country as large and diverse as the USA. This is really, really important because from north to east to south to west, the USA is vast in terms of its its ethnicities that it has within its own countries, but also in terms of ideological views, okay? As a result of the fact that there's a plethora, a myriad of ideological views across the whole country, it is necessary for states to have their own rights, their own government, so that they're able to accurately represent their citizens as well, because that cannot always be done from a national level, particularly when the country is so large and diverse. So essentially, there's an idea that then people in the USA are governed by two governments, okay? Firstly, the state government, so the state that they live in that has a government, but also the federal government as well, okay? Now, there's various factors leading to the increased role of the federal government in the latter part of the 19th century and the sort of early part, of the first 2/3 of the 20th century. So you've got westward expansion when, because the 13 original colonies were on the east coast of America, when they expanded westwards and new areas and new states were found. You've got population growth, you've got industrialization, improvements in communication, the Great Depression in the 1930s, which was an economic crisis which needed to be dealt with centrally by the federal government. You've got foreign policy and wars after the Pearl Harbor attack on the 8th of December 1941. The USA became involved in the Second World War after a period of isolationism, and that sort of brought them back into the sort of international arena. And what occurs after that, of course, is at the end of the Second World War, two global superpowers emerge, the USSR and the USA, and then there's the Cold War ensues, an ideological battle between capitalism and communism. The US are committed to prevent the spread of communism in Eastern Europe and many parts of Asia. So that leads to the role that sort of has led to the role of the federal government sort of expanding. So the federal government has expanded the remits of their role and sort of their powers as well. So how does cooperation between federal government and states work in practice? Now, one of the key things here is that there's funding that the federal government can provide to states, and states might often compete for this funding, as you can see here. But traditionally, these are called block grants or categorical grants. You can read about those here. But essentially, the idea is that the federal government can pressurize state governments into acting in a certain way or doing certain things, because otherwise the federal government might block funding to different state governments. Okay, and you can read about that here. Federal mandates are laws passed by the government which force states to comply. They often lead to conflict between the federal government and the state governments, but states can also try to overturn these restrictions in the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court is a body in the USA, the judiciary is a body in the USA, which is responsible for making interpretative amendments to the Constitution. So they analyze the wording of the Constitution and apply it and provide judgments according to the different cases which come before them. So in the Shelby County v. Holder case in 2013, parts of, obviously, federal law were overturned when key provisions of the Voting Rights Act signed in 1965 were struck down and declared unconstitutional. Now, this gave states more sort of freedom to decide their own election laws. You can also read about an example here. So conflict over transgender bathroom laws at the start of 2017. 14 states had restrictive laws, while many others were in the process of passing those laws. And when in office, Obama had attempted to place restrictions on states by threatening to withhold federal education funding if discriminatory practice was present. Now, Trump, however, has lifted attempts at federal regulation of this issue, arguing that it's a states' right issue. So that's another sort of element of conflict between federal and state governments. Again, you can read about California and the legalization of marijuana. But now, instead of states raising an issue with the federal government, just as you saw in the last Supreme Court case of Shelby County v. Holder, the federal government can also challenge state governments. Okay, and we see this with the legalization of marijuana in California. Now, the Interstate Commerce Clause, an implied power of Congress, that states, there was a Supreme Court case here, and the federal government argued through the Gonzalez v. Reich Supreme Court case in 2005 that essentially the legalization of marijuana in California would affect interstate commerce, because cannabis produced in California would have an impact on the supply and demand of the drug across the USA, affecting interstate commerce. Interstate is also, it essentially means between states, and commerce means trade, okay? And as a result of that, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the federal government here, okay? Now, the separation of powers. The separation of powers is a theory whereby political power is distributed among the legislature, the executive and the judiciary, each of them both acting independently and interdependently, okay? So independently in the sense that they're separated institutions in terms of their buildings, which are completely distinct and separate, and their personnel, okay? So no one member is allowed to be a member of more than one branch of government, okay? So you cannot have no one member in the political system in the USA is allowed to be more than a member of more than one particular branch. Now, the reason why this sort of separation of powers was instituted by the founding fathers is because they did not want one branch of government to become overly powerful. Okay, so they had a fear of tyranny since the days of when the British ruled them, and they were sort of unwilling to see those days reappear. Now, in terms of examples for separation of power, Barack Obama is a senator, and he resigns as a senator in 2008, of course, before he runs for president. Okay, so he's resigning from his seat in Congress, and then he's eligible to run for Congress. Now, there's not a complete separation. There's two exceptions. Okay, the first is the most important. The vice president is also officially, okay, president of the Senate, and they can cast tie-breaking votes. Dick Cheney used this 8 times between 2001 and 2009. Okay, the president can also issue pardons to convicted offenders. Okay, so that is basically sort of forgiving them of the crimes that they've previously committed. Now, but this one is really important. Okay, the role of the vice president, particularly in light of U.S. government today. Mike Pence has cast a tie-breaking vote in the Senate 13 times. The last time a vice president cast more than 10 tie-breaking votes was in the 1870s, okay? Obviously, it says Pence has already cast 6. That's because this headline's taken from 2017, yeah? To date, he has cast 13 tie-breaking votes. It shows you then the sort of increase in the powers of the vice president in particular. Moving on, separation of powers is not an entirely accurate term. Richard Mustat stated that it created a government of separated institutions sharing powers, that the Constitution is a government of separated institutions sharing powers, because obviously these institutions are separate in terms of personnel and buildings, but they're ultimately sharing powers. They need to work together, okay, and act interdependently to get things done, okay, by the branches of government negotiating, reaching consensus and compromise, they're able to get things done. Okay, and this is what the checks and balances are all about, which we'll discover. The professor has also described it as having 2 halves of a banknote, each useless without each other, in relation to the relationship between the legislative branch and the executive branch of government in the USA, that they both need each other to work, otherwise it's basically flawed. Checks and balances. Now, checks and balances exist between the different branches of government, okay? And these work alongside the separation of powers. And they force the 3 branches of government to share power, okay? To work together to get things done. So it's not just through checks, but denial of certain powers to each of the branches of government. So, for example, the president has the sort of power to persuade, in the sense that they can only suggest legislation to Congress to introduce through the State of the Union address. They are not able to introduce legislation themselves, the executive branch, in Congress, because none of them are members which sit in Congress, okay? Apart from, obviously, the vice president, who is president of the Senate, who presides as president over the Senate. And as a result of that, it's primarily up to Congress to introduce and implement legislation. Now, in relation to which branch has the most checking power and which is the most checked and why, the branch which has the most checking power is the legislative branch. The legislative branch exercises these checks upon the executive, and they exercise these checks upon the judiciary, okay? So they have the most checking power, as you can see. Now, the branch, of course, which is the most checked, of course, then, is the executive branch. Now, the reason why the legislative branch has the most checking power is because, obviously, it is elected, the 435 members in the House of Representatives and the 100 members in the Senate, they're elected by the people directly, okay? They are the sort of representatives of the people, and representatives and senators have a responsibility to take into account the interests of their constituents, because obviously they're accountable to them. Okay. Of course, the executive branch is the most checked because of the fact that the founding fathers did not want one branch of government or one individual, for example, the president, to hold too much power, or a group of people in the executive administration to abuse their power, or for it to become an overpowerful executive branch of government. Okay, so they really had this sort of fear of tyrannical government, of anything being resembling the sort of British who originally ruled the 13 colonies. Okay, so that is why. Now, bipartisanship is close cooperation between two major parties to achieve desired political goals. So that is the Democrat Party and the Republican Party working close together to achieve desired political goals. The Constitution requires compromise. Okay, it expects compromise. The founding fathers developed this intricate system of a separation of powers and checks and balances to ensure that the branches of government would work with each other to enact laws, to get things done. Okay, the Constitution also requires supermajorities for in Congress for constitutional amendments, and therefore bipartisanship, both major parties working together, is necessary for those constitutional amendments to be passed. So the Senate, to ratify treaties, 3/4 of the Senate need to agree on that. Nowadays, with almost equal representation of both parties in the Senate, give or take a few seats, of course, a 3/4 majority can only really be achieved to ratify a treaty with cross-party support, both the Democrats and the Republicans working together. Here we've got a few examples of bipartisanship in Congress, but when bipartisanship fails, it can lead to gridlock. Okay, so just as we talk about legislative ping pong in UK Parliament between the House of Lords and the House of Commons, whereby bills can bounce back and forth, and also the fact that it can lead to gridlock as well because of the 1949 Parliament Act and the capability of the laws to delay the passage of legislation for a year. In America, similarly, where bipartisanship fails, gridlock can ensue. Okay. Now, divided government is when the House of Representatives or the Senate and the presidency are not controlled by one party. Which means that if even one of these chambers of Congress, okay, are controlled by a different party to these two, then it's divided government. Okay, for it to be unified government, the same party needs to be controlling the executive branch, so the presidency, the House of Representatives, and the Senate, for there to be unified government. Which means that for there to be divided government, only one of those three need to be controlled by a different party. Today, as a result of the 2018 midterm elections in the USA, obviously the Republicans still control the presidency because the president's Trump. House of Representatives, however, has been won back by the Democrats. So the Democrats control the House of Representatives. The Republicans still control the Senate. So we have a period of divided government. Okay, parties now need to work together to get things done. Okay. Today, the constitutional requirement for bipartisanship has led to a major constitutional challenge, with parties becoming more polarized, which means sort of a larger gap between both of them on opposite ends of the political spectrum, as they're becoming more ideologically opposed to each other. And for example, the Democrats going more towards the left and the Republicans more towards the right, they're less likely to agree with each other. Okay, there's less scope for compromise, and Congress has been able to legislate less, pass fewer laws, leading to a weak government. Okay, and this can also lead to gridlock then as well. And this is obviously not quite what Madison had in mind. Donald Trump wearing some sort of army jacket, sitting in some little hub, whereby obviously these computers look like they're radars and obviously have some nuclear codes and that. Now, this goes through periods of unified government and divided government, as you can see, but it also prompts us to think about a number of key questions. So does divided government make bipartisanship more difficult? 100%. Okay, divided government makes bipartisanship more difficult because one of the sort of branches of government or one of the chambers of Congress are controlled by a different party, which makes it more difficult in today's day and age of hyper-partisanship, increased ideological polarization. It makes it more difficult for those parties to agree with each other on various sets of policies. Okay. Now, here you can read about criticisms of the separation of powers and checks and balances. Now, this is obviously key for the final column, which asks you to speak about how effectively have these key principles been upheld today, sort of in the USA. Now, it's been argued that the system offers an invitation to struggle to the executive and legislative branches in particular, and can be a recipe for institutional gridlock. Okay, particularly the case when there's divided government, and there's some examples here. Now, that can result in government shutdowns, okay? And government shutdown is basically when the appropriations for the following year are not passed by Congress to the executive branch of government, and therefore, if they're not able to reach a compromise, then government shutdown ensues, okay? And we'll learn more about that going forwards when we study Congress in particular. Now, obviously, the argument here is that they need to work together to achieve desired political goals, but also just to get things done. But the problem is the growth in partisanship and polarization of the two parties over the past 20 years has made that much, much more difficult, okay? So that's government shutdown, that's explained there. Now, limited government is, of course, the fact that the federal government should really play a limited role in the everyday lives of individuals, and it should sort of leave the states to a certain laws, which are obviously, of course, under their jurisdiction. So it states that perhaps the federal government should play less of a role in the lives of individuals in society, and it should also take it should lack interference in sort of welfare programs or social programs, etc., etc. And that is spoken about here. So, for example, modern conceptions of limited government cover the extent to which the federal government plays a role in social and economic policies. Okay, for conservatives and particularly libertarians, there is a desire to reduce government involvement in areas such as expenditure, for example, on welfare provision. Social programs are frowned upon as being part of the big government agenda, and that is rejected by many in the USA. Of course, that prompts you to think about what liberals, for example, might argue, that government should play a role to expand sort of welfare, but to also expand equality, as the federal government needed to during the civil rights era. They needed to step in, they needed to play a greater role in society to ensure that civil rights were enforced. I hope that's helped you, 13s. If you've got any questions, please let me know. What I need you to do, one of the key things here, is that final column, how effectively are these sort of principles upheld today in the USA, that requires a little bit of thinking and a little bit of analysis. And please use the slides for the various principles to go through that. So, for example, for federalism, okay, when evaluating how effectively it operates today, look at this slide and look at this slide, okay? Look at these examples. What does it tell you? For the separation of powers, of course, look at this slide. So this is focused on separation of powers and checks and balances. So for those two principles, look at this slide for that last column. For bipartisanship, have a look at this. Okay, have a look at these arguments. Okay, you can also have a look at some of these arguments here. Okay, bipartisanship or partisanship are polar opposites. Bipartisanship means both parties working together to achieve desired political goals, but partisanship basically denotes the fact that parties are acting in a partisan manner, which means they're unlikely to negotiate with each other. They're unlikely to reach consensus and compromise because of the fact that they're sort of individual parties with individual sort of ideological standpoints that don't coincide with each other. And that basically means that they're unwilling to work together. So partisanship denotes parties, the two major parties, unwilling to work together to achieve any sort of political goals, okay? And then for limited government, if you just have a look at this slide over here, I hope that's helped, year 13s. I'll see you guys soon.